He'd been driving since dawn, a rusted pickup crawling through the gray highways of the Pacific Northwest, the kind of roads that forget where they end. Behind the wheel was Elias Ward, 30, a man whose face looked older than his age. In the passenger seat, a German shepherd named Nova sat quietly, eyes steady, ears alert, the kind of stillness that only comes from loyalty born in fire. They used to belong to a unit. Now, they belonged nowhere. Elias had been a soldier once. Afghanistan, dust, noise, and the smell of burned metal. He could still see it sometimes, the blur of light before the blast, the sound that follows when the world collapses in your chest. He came home, but something of him didn't. Something stayed behind, buried in the sand with the men he couldn't save. Since then, home was a word that never quite fit. He tried cities, they pushed him out. He tried people, they drifted away. What remained was Nova and the road. At night, they slept in the truck. The seats smelled of old coffee and engine oil. Sometimes Elias would wake to the sound of Nova growling at nothing, or maybe at everything. He'd reach over, touch the dog's neck, and whisper, "It's okay, girl, I see it too." Last night, a cop had knocked on his window. Two sharp raps that cut through the silence. "Sir, you can't park here. This is private property." Elias nodded. "Just needed a few hours." The officer sighed. The kind of sigh that says, "I've seen too many like you. Find a shelter downtown." "Can't stay, yeah." So he drove off again. No destination. Just the endless loop of not belonging anywhere. He'd stopped talking much these days. Words had lost their weight. But Nova, she didn't need words. She'd been with him since the war, trained to detect explosives, to move through fear as if it were just another form of air. Now, she was his last link to the version of himself that used to believe in missions, orders, and purpose. Sometimes, when the radio caught a bit of static that sounded like faraway gunfire, Nova would lift her head, eyes searching. Elias would glance over and mutha, "I hear it too." Then he'd turn the radio off and keep driving. The Northwest rolled by in shades of moss and fog forests, leaning close to the road like old listeners. He passed towns with names he couldn't pronounce, faces that looked the other way. Gas stations, diners, abandoned motels. Each one whispered the same thing: keep moving. He didn't know what he was running from or toward. He only knew the silence was safer than stopping. That morning, as the sky turned the color of worn steel, Elias pulled over near a ridge overlooking a river valley. He killed the engine. Nova jumped out first, tail wagging once, twice testing the air. Elias stretched, his back aching from too many nights in the driver's seat. The world smelled of pine and rain-soaked dirt. For a brief moment it felt like something close to peace. He crouched beside Nova, rubbed her neck. "Guess it's just us again," he said softly. She leaned into him, eyes half closed. Like she understood. He didn't know that before nightfall. A faded roadside sign would change everything. A sign that read, "County auction abandoned property at Raven Creek. Starting bid, $25. But for now it was just the road, the dog, and the man who still hadn't figured out whether he was escaping the past, or being quietly led somewhere he was meant to find. The morning broke in slow motion, gray clouds hanging low, a thin drizzle streaking the windshield of Elias's old pickup. The kind of rain that doesn't soak you, it just follows you, like a memory that refuses to leave. He'd stopped at a gas station off Highway 12, a place that smelled of diesel and burnt coffee, where the cashier didn't look up when you walked in. He filled the tank halfway, the most he could afford, and bored a stale sandwich and a bottle of water. Total, $9.60. He counted it twice before handing the cash over. That left $27.60 in his pocket. A man's life, reduced to the sound of a few coins. When he stepped back out, the clouds had lifted just enough for a sliver of light to spill through. Nova sat by the truck, head tilted, watching a crow picking at crumbs near the curb. Her ears twitched as Elias approached. She always heard him before she saw him. "Ready, girl," he murmured. She wagged her tail once, like a nod. They drove off again, the road winding through pine and fog, the kind of landscape that blurs into your thoughts. Elias didn't know where they were going. He only knew they couldn't stay still. There's something about drifting that becomes addictive when you move long enough. You start to believe stillness means failure. A few miles out of town, the rain let up. The sun broke through in thin stripes, glinting off the hood of the truck, and that's when he saw it, a faded wooden sign, nailed to a leaning fence post. Barely clinging to the edge of the road, the paint was peeling. The words sun-bleached and cracked. County auction abandoned property at Raven Creek. Starting bid, $25. He almost missed it. But something about that phrase, abandoned property by the creek, caught in his chest. He slowed down, the tires crunching on the shoulder gravel. Nova lifted her head, ears pricking. Elias stared at the sign. It wasn't much. Just another county notice about repossessed land or tax default properties, the kind of thing most people drove past without a thought. But for him, it felt like something different. A whisper, a hand on the shoulder from a place that didn't belong to this world. Abandoned property by the creek. The words rolled around in his mind, heavy and strangely comforting. There was something honest about the idea of a place forgotten, maybe because he felt like that too, forgotten, left behind, waiting for someone to notice. He looked down at Nova. She was staring out the windshield, ears forward, like she was waiting for him to make a decision. He let out a low breath. "Well," he said quietly, "we've slept behind worse places than a creek." He pulled a folded map from the glove box, a wrinkled relic from another decade, stained with coffee and rain. There it was, Raven Creek, somewhere deep in the forest region, a thin blue line twisting between ridges. Barely marked on the page. He checked the mileage, did a rough calculation. If the auction was real and if the place was even standing, it couldn't be more than an hour away. He had enough gas, barely, enough cash, almost. $27.60. He'd be down to $2 if he bid. He rubbed his thumb against the steering wheel, thinking. The hum of the engine filled the silence. Then he spoke, half to himself, half to the ghost of someone who might still be listening. "What's the worst that could happen? Another night under a roof that isn't ours." He put the truck in gear. The tires slipped a little on the wet gravel before catching traction. The arrow on the sign pointed east into the woods. If he followed it, the road narrowed into a cracked rural lane, moss-covered fences, ferns, reaching across the shoulder like green fingers. The deeper they drove, the quieter it got. No other cars, no signs of life except the rhythmic panting of Nova beside him. The world outside seemed untouched by time. Every mile pulled him further from everything familiar, and strangely, that felt right. The more distance between him and the world he used to know, the easier it was to breathe. He passed an old mile marker, half buried in mud. Then another sign, newer, with white paint, auction property, Raven Creek, 1 mile ahead. Elias tightened his grip on the wheel. Something in his chest flickered, not excitement, not fear, something quieter. Hope, maybe, the kind that feels too fragile to say out loud. He looked at Nova again. Her head was out the window, ears flapping in the wind, eyes bright for the first time in weeks. She looked alive, free. He smiled, a small, tired curve that felt almost foreign on his face. "All right, partner," he said softly. "Let's go see what $25 can buy." The trees parted ahead, and for a heartbeat, the sun lit the valley below, a sliver of water winding through a hollow, and beyond it, something small, stone-colored, and still standing. He didn't know what he was looking at yet, but he knew one thing for sure. For the first time in a long, long time, he wasn't driving away from something. He was driving toward it. The county auction wasn't much of an event, just a pop-up tent in the middle of a dry, uneven field. 2 government clerks in neon vests sat behind a folding table, one fanning herself with a clipboard, the other scrolling his phone. There were no crowds, no bid, no fast-talking auctioneer with a microphone. Just the wind scraping through the grass and the faint buzz of an old fluorescent lamp swinging above them heads. Elias parked his pickup under a dying oak tree. Nova jumped down first, her paws pressing against the dusty ground, tail low but alert. The air smelled of rain that never came. He walked toward the table, his boots crunching against the gravel. "You're here for the auction?" the man behind the table asked, not looking up. "Yeah," Elias said. His voice sounded strange in the empty space, like it didn't belong anywhere. The clerk flipped through a thin folder and spoke with a bored tone. "All right. County seized property. No utilities. No guarantee of safety or condition. Cabin's been unoccupied since '79. Owner died. No heirs, no claims. Starting bid $25. Elias blinked. 25, 25, the man repeated. "You want to see the photos?" He turned the folder around. There were 3 grainy pictures, a small cabin swallowed by weeds, a crooked porch, and a creek running behind it, black and glassy under the trees, the kind of place most people would drive past without slowing down. But Elias didn't drive past anymore. He'd been running from places that didn't want him. Maybe it was time to stop. He glanced back at his truck. Nova was sitting in the passenger seat, her head tilted, eyes locked on him through the glass. That silent question, "Is this it?" He turned back to the clerk. "I'll bid 25. The woman with the clipboard raised an eyebrow. "Anyone else?" The field stayed quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "All right then," she said, tapping her pen. "Sold. $25. Elias reached into his wallet. The bills were soft from being folded too long. A 10, a 5, and a couple of crumpled singles. He counted them out carefully. His hands shook a little. The man took the money, scribbled on a receipt, and handed over a small metal key attached to a faded tag. The edges were rusted, the number barely visible, lot number 14. Along with it came a county map, creased and yellowed, with a red X marking Raven Creek Cabin. "That's it?" Elias asked. "That's it," the clerk said. "You're the new owner, or whatever's left of it." Elias turned the key in his hand. It was heavier than it looked. When he walked back to the truck, the afternoon light had already started to fade. The wind carried the scent of pine and old soil. Nova jumped down again, circling him once before sitting at his feet. He crouched, resting his palm on her neck. "Well, partner," he murmured, "looks like we've got ourselves a place." Nova let out a soft chuff, half a sigh, half a bark, as if she knew something was changing, something important. Elias climbed into the driver's seat, unfolded the map across the steering wheel. The ink had bled from years of humidity. The roads were little more than gray threads leading toward a patch of forest labeled Raven Creek Preserve. He stared at the map for a long time. His thumb brushed over the red X again and again. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt a flicker of something close to curiosity. Not quite hope, that was too strong a word, but a quiet stirring in his chest. The kind you get when you realize you might not have reached the end of the road just yet. He turned the key in the ignition. The engine coughed, hesitated, then came alive. Nova rested her head against the window. Ears perked toward the sound of the wind. "Raven Creek," Elias said softly, as if testing the name. He wasn't sure what waited for them there, probably nothing but rotten dust. But even nothing was better than nowhere. As the pickup rolled down the empty county road, Nova lifted her head and watched the landscape pass by, hills fading into forest, forests fading into the kind of dark that promised secrets. In the side mirror, the tent and the two clerks grew smaller until they vanished completely. All that was left was the open road, a rusted key, and a feeling that maybe, just maybe, this was where the story turned. The road narrowed the deeper Elias drove. It wasn't much of a road anymore, just a forgotten stretch of dirt winding through miles of pine forest, with roots breaking through the earth and fog clinging to the edges like something alive. The map on the passenger seat had stopped being useful an hour ago. Now, only instinct and the faint sound of water somewhere ahead guided him. The sun was sinking behind the tree line, spilling streaks of violet and gold across the clouds. Every few minutes the light disappeared completely, swallowed by the towering trees. The air grew colder. Nova, sitting beside him, had her head out the window, ears twitching. The smell of pine resin, damp moss, and rain-soaked soil filled the cab. Elias rubbed his thumb against the rusted key dangling from the ignition. The tag still read lot no 14, barely legible under the dirt. He hadn't said much since they'd left the county field, and Nova hadn't asked for anything. That was the kind of understanding they had, quiet, steady, built from too many nights in too many strange places. The tires hit a patch of gravel, and the truck lurched forward, its old engine groaning. Then the forest opened up. Before them lay a wide basin wrapped in fog. A small lake shimmered at the center, its surface smooth as glass, catching the last blush of daylight. From one corner of the lake, a stream wound its way through the rocks, a silver ribbon that disappeared beneath a ridge. Raven Creek, the name echoed in Elias's mind, quiet but firm, like it had been waiting for him. He eased the truck down the slope, the headlights cutting through the mist. At the bottom of the hill, a dirt path branched off toward the creek. It was overgrown, nearly erased by years of neglect, but still there as if it had been waiting to. The cabin appeared almost by accident. One moment there was only the blur of trees. The next, the outline of a stone wall began to take shape beneath the fog. It sat under a hill, half hidden by ivy and shadow. The chimney leaned slightly, and the roof was blanketed in moss thick enough to hide its original color. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, a wooden sign, nailed to the porch railing, that had long since faded, but under the dirt and decay, Elias could still make out two faint words carved into it. Haven Rest. He let the engine idle for a moment, staring through the windshield. Haven Rest, he whispered. A peaceful refuge. He almost laughed, a dry, disbelieving sound. If peace exists, maybe it looks like this. He killed the engine, and the silence that followed was enormous. The kind of silence that holds its breath. Not empty, but alive. The forest around him hummed faintly, the sound of crickets, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant whisper of the creek. Nova jumped out first, padding toward the porch. Her tail swayed once, then stilled. She sniffed the air, cautious but curious. Elias followed, stepping carefully on the uneven ground. The porch creaked beneath his boots, and a cloud of dust rose where he stepped. He ran his hand along the wooden post. The bark of time had taken over everything, even the nails were rusted to the color of old blood. He pushed the door gently. It didn't open. He pushed harder. It gave way with a long, low groan. Inside was darkness, thick and unmoving. He clicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through the dust, catching shapes: a table, overturned chairs, shelves lined with jars clouded from age, cobwebs hung like curtains. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a memory of one. Elias stepped further in. Each sound, each movement felt like an intrusion. The floorboards moaned under his weight. In the corner, an old rocking chair stood perfectly still, yet he could almost imagine it swaying. On the mantel above a cold, crumbling fireplace, a single photograph lay face down beneath a layer of dust. He turned it over carefully. A family, a man, a woman, a child standing in front of the same cabin, years ago. The man's hand rested on the woman's shoulder, and the child was holding something small and furry, a puppy, maybe, all of them smiling. Elias stared at the picture for a long time. There was something both comforting and painful about it. It reminded him of all the things that didn't survive the years: faces, places, feelings that once seemed unbreakable. He set the photo back down and stepped outside. The light had almost vanished, and the first stars were beginning to appear. The fog rolled slowly across the lake, glowing faintly under the moonlight. He took a deep breath. The air tasted clean, sharp, and new in a way he hadn't felt in years. Nova came to sit beside him. Her fur brushed against his leg, grounding him in the moment. "Looks like this is home," he murmured. Nova looked up at him, eyes glinting in the dark. Then, as if agreeing, she lay down at his feet. Elias sat on the porch, leaning against the railing. His mind was quiet, not empty, just quiet, the way a field goes still after the rain. For the first time in a long time, he didn't think about what he'd lost. He didn't replay the screams, or the explosions, or the face of the man he couldn't save. He just listened to the creak, the wind, the slow rhythm of his own breathing. There was still work ahead: repairs, cleaning, figuring out how to make this place livable. But right now, it didn't matter. Right now, the world wasn't asking for anything, and for a man who'd spent years running, that was enough. The cabin breathed when he opened it again that night. It wasn't the kind of breath that came from life, more like the slow exhale of something that had been asleep for too long. The air inside was thick with dust, the smell of wet timber and old smoke still clinging to the walls, the kind of scent that carried memories of winters long gone, of fires that once kept someone warm. Elias set his flashlight on a shelf and ran his hand along a stone mantel, cold, grainy. Beneath its soot, his fingers found carvings, initials, maybe, long faded. He wondered who they belonged to, what kind of nights they had spent here: lovers, a family, someone else like him, running from ghosts. He set down his pack, took a deep breath, and crouched by the fireplace. The hearth was blackened and full of ash, but a few half-burnt logs still lay there, brittle but dry. He brushed away the debris, stacked the wood the way his father had taught him when he was a kid, and struck a match. The flame hesitated, flickered, almost gave up, then caught. It started as a whisper, then a crackle, and finally a steady breath of warmth that reached across the small room. Shadows danced up the walls, stretching long and thin, and for the first time, the place didn't feel entirely abandoned. Nova padded closer, her nails clicking softly on the wood floor. She circled once, twice, and then curled up beside his boots. Her eyes glowed amber in the firelight, reflecting the same quiet awe that Elias felt, the same disbelief that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't another night in the truck. He sat back against the old chair frame, feeling the stiffness of the wood beneath him. His hands hovered near the fire, soaking in the heat. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters, carrying the faint rush of the creek. The world beyond the cabin was all fog and shadow, but in here, the orange light pulsed gently, alive, warm, human. He stared into the flames and whispered, almost without meaning to, "We've got a roof now, old friend." His voice cracked a little. The words felt strange, heavy, like they hadn't been used in years. Nova lifted her head, ears twitching, then let out a small sigh, the kind that said, "I hear you." For a moment, everything else fell away. The noise, the memories, the static that had filled his mind since the desert gone, just the sound of fire and breath. It had been a long time since he'd felt something like this. Not comfort exactly, not happiness, but stillness, the kind that asks for nothing. He leaned his elbows on his knees, staring at the embers. "You remember, don't you?" he murmured, "the base camp. The nights we'd stay awake listening for mortar. Every sound meant something." The dog didn't move, just kept her eyes on him, steady and patient. Elias smiled faintly. Guess we don't have to listen like that anymore. The fire popped a single ember, jumping into the air and dying before it hit the floor. He thought about all the places he'd called home these last few years: parking lots, underpasses, rest stops off the interstate, places where you learned to keep your shoes on when you slept, just in case you had to move fast. And yet, sitting here in this decaying cabin with its sagging beams and drafty corners, he felt safer than he had in a long time. He unzipped his jacket, tossed it onto a chair, and leaned his head back. His shoulders relaxed, his pulse slowed. Something in him, something that had been locked tight since the war, gave just a little, like the first turn of a key in a rusted lock. The light from the fire flickered against the walls, painting the room in shades of gold and red. He watched the shadows move, breathing in the smell of wood smoke and old stone. It reminded him of nights back home before the uniform, before the desert heat, before everything fell apart. Nights when his mother would read by the fire while his father worked on a broken radio. The same patient rhythm of fixing, listening, fixing again. That rhythm had stopped the day the war began, and maybe, without realizing it, he'd stopped too. But here, in this forgotten cabin at the edge of the world, Elias felt something shift, a pulse, faint but steady. His chest rose and fell with the same rhythm as the fire. Alive, still here. He reached down and rubbed Nobazia. "You did good, girl," he whispered. "You got us here." Her tail thumped once against the floor. Elias smiled, a real one this time, small but true. He looked toward the window. Outside, mist hung low over the trees, catching the moonlight like silver smoke. Somewhere beyond it, the creek whispered to the stones, a sound that felt ancient, eternal. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether this place would hold, whether the roof would leak, whether he'd even stay. But for tonight, that didn't matter. Tonight, he had fire, he had a roof, he had his dog. And for a man who'd seen the world at its worst, that was enough. He lay down on the floor beside Nova, using his jacket as a pillow. The wood was hard beneath him, but the warmth was real. The fire crackled, dimmed, then steadied again. Like a slow, quiet heartbeat, Elias closed his eyes. In that moment, somewhere between waking and sleep, he felt it, the faint, unfamiliar rhythm returning to his chest. The heart that had gone silent in the desert began to beat again, not loud, not strong, but enough. And as the cabin breathed beside him, and Nova sighed softly in her dreams, Elias Ward finally, after all those years, began to remember what it felt like to be human again. Morning came slowly to Haven Rest. It wasn't sunlight that woke him, not really. It was the silence. That deep, untouched kind of quiet that only exists far from people, far from roads, far from everything that hums and blinks and demands your attention. The kind of quiet that feels like it's listening back. Elias opened his eyes. The fire had burned itself down to a few glowing coals. Ash drifted in the air like snow, catching the thin stripe of morning light pushing through a crack in the shutter. Nova was still asleep beside him, chest rising and falling in slow rhythm, her nose twitching at the smell of smoke and pine. He sat up, joints stiff, and looked around. The place looked less haunted in daylight. The walls, though cracked and darkened by time, carried the soft gleam of the morning. A few cobwebs swayed lazily in the corners. The floor was coated in years of dust, but under that, he could see the outlines of an old rug long gone, but somehow still there in memory. Elias stretched, rubbed his face, and said quietly, "Guess we'd better see what we've got here." Nova blinked awake at the sound of his voice. Her ears perked up, and she gave a little grunt, not quite ready to start the day but unwilling to be left behind. He spent the next hour cleaning, not because he needed to, there was no one to impress, but because it felt right. Every movement, every sweep of the broom through the dust, was like uncovering someone's story. He imagined what it must have been like. Whoever lived here lost, tending fires, fixing leaks, keeping this place alive. He moved some old metal sheets stacked by the fireplace, clearing the debris that had gathered behind them. That's when he heard it, the dull clink of something wooden hitting stone. Elias froze. He knelt down and pulled away the last piece of rusted tin. Beneath it was a small box, the size of a lunch pail. Carved from oak, time had darkened it. The surface warped and splintered, but it was intact. He ran his thumb over the latch. The hinge groaned, but it opened. Inside a few things. Simple, ordinary, but somehow heavy with meaning. The first was a photograph, black and white, its edges curled. A man stood by a creek, same one that ran outside. Elias was sure of it, wearing work clothes and a smile that came easy. Beside him sat a dog, a shepherd by the look of it. Strong, proud, eyes bright. Elias studied the image for a long time. Something about it hit him deep. Maybe it was the way the man's hand rested on the dog's head. or the way the dog looked back at him, like it understood everything without needing words. He thought of himself and Nova, the way they'd moved through the years, side by side through things neither of them could explain. He turned the photo over. On the back, faint pencil marks spelled out just a few words. Raven Creek, 1979, the year the clerk had mentioned. The year the house went quiet. He set the photo down and reached back into the box. The second item was a folded piece of paper, yellowed, edges brittle. He opened it carefully. In a looping, careful hand, someone had written, "To whoever finds this place, be kind to it, and it will be kind to you." He read the line again, then again. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't even a warning. It was something gentler, something human. Elias sat back on his heels, the note trembling slightly in his hands. He thought about the years, all the ones he'd lost, the ones he'd barely survived, about the way war had stripped everything down to instinct and noise, about the faces that had faded, the homes that had burned, the promises that never made it back from the desert. And yet, here in a forgotten cabin beside a half-frozen creek, a stranger from another lifetime had left a message for him, or maybe for anyone who needed it. Be kind to it, and it will be kind to you. He looked around the room again. The stones, the beams, the little cracks where light slipped through. This wasn't just shelter. It was memory, someone else's, now reaching into his. He ran his thumb over the ink once more, folded the note back the way it had been, and placed it beside the photograph. Then he whispered, "I'll try." Nova wandered over, tail swishing lazily, nose brushing against the open box. She sniffed the photo, the paper, and then gave a soft huff, her version of approval. Elias smiled. "Guess he had one of you too, huh?" The dog wagged her tail once, slow and sure. He set the box carefully on the mantel above the fireplace, not as decoration, as a promise, a small, wordless pact between past and present. When he stepped outside later, the air was cool and damp. Mist clung to the trees like ghosts reluctant to leave. The creek below glimmered in the morning light, quiet but alive. Elias walked down the slope and stood where the man in the photograph had stood. He could almost see him there, hammer in hand, dog at his feet, building something that would last. Maybe that's what this place wanted, not an owner, but a caretaker, someone who'd listen, someone who'd stay. He reached down, picked up a smooth stone from the edge of the water, and held it in his palm. It was cold, heavy, perfect. "All right," he said quietly, "let's take care of each other." Then, when he turned back toward the cabin, the sunlight had shifted, landing just right on the roof, making it glow faintly through the fog. And for the first time, Elias Ward felt the faint warmth of belonging, not because he'd earned it, but because this place, this strange, breathing place, had decided to let him in. He climbed the steps back to the door. Nova followed close, brushing against his leg. Inside, the fire had come alive again, just embers before, but now glowing steady, as if answering him. He paused in the doorway and looked around. Then, without really knowing why, he said it out loud. "Thank you." The walls didn't answer, but the air shifted almost imperceptibly, the faintest creak of wood, the soft hum of stone warming in the firelight. Elias smiled. Somewhere deep inside Haven Rest, something old seemed to stir awake, and though he couldn't explain it, he knew he wasn't alone anymore. The first few days after Elias and Nova found the cabin were spent in silence, the kind of silence that only the wilderness can make. It wasn't empty, it was full of the hum of wind against the pine, the crack of frozen branches, and the soft sound of paws pressing into the dirt. Elias got to work. He patched the roof with old shingles he found leaning against the shed. He fixed the door. It had been torn off one hinge, probably by wind or time. He couldn't tell, and Nova followed him everywhere, her tail brushing against his legs, her fur catching bits of dust and wood chips, her eyes always watching. There was something sacred in the rhythm of repair, every nail driven in, every board replaced, every window cleaned. It all felt like a quiet ritual of resurrection. And slowly, the house began to breathe again. The first time Elias noticed it, he thought it was just the wind, a low vibration, deep under the floorboards, soft, almost like a hum. It wasn't constant. It came in gentle waves, like the pulse of the earth itself. He paused his hammer mid-swing, crouched down, and pressed his palm to the floor. There it was again, a steady, low thrum, barely audible but definitely there. Nova seemed to hear it too. She tilted her head, ears twitching. Then she walked toward the center of the room, laid down and pressed her head against the floor. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The fire crackled softly behind them. Elias exhaled, slow. It felt peaceful. He didn't know what to make of it. Maybe it was groundwater, or an old pipe, or just the way sound carried through wood that had been soaked and dried 100 times, but it didn't feel like that. It felt alive. And for reasons he couldn't explain, Elias didn't want to question it. By the third night, the house felt different. The air was warmer, not just from the fire, but from something else, something unseen. When he breathed, the walls seemed to breathe with him. When he moved, the shadows shifted. Not against him but with him. Nova slept curled up by the hearth, her chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm with that strange, quiet hum beneath the floor. Elias sat by the window, watching the snowdrift past the glass. His reflection stared back, tired, lined, but softer somehow. He hadn't seen that face in years. He leaned closer to the glass. It was fogged from the heat of the fire and his own breath, and that's when he saw it. Faint, almost invisible at first, a line of words forming slowly on the misted pane. "You are safe." He froze. The words were written from the inside. The handwriting was thin, almost childlike, but trembling like someone had written it with a shaking hand. Nova lifted her head, ears pricked, sensing the stillness in the air. Elias didn't move for a long time. His first thought was logical. Maybe he'd done it himself without remembering. Or maybe it was just streaks from cleaning earlier, catching the condensation in just the right way. But deep down, he knew better. This place, it wasn't ordinary. He reached out and wiped the window with his sleeve. The words vanished under the motion of his arm. He sat back, trying to laugh it off, but the sound didn't come. Instead, he whispered almost to himself, "Thank you." And in that quiet moment, he could have sworn the house heard him. The hum beneath the floor grew a touch deeper, warmer, steadier. The fire popped softly, and the air seemed to sigh like an exhale after years of holding breath. Elias looked around the small room, at the walls patched with uneven planks, the crooked door, the dark stone fireplace, the faint glow of life finally returning to something long forgotten. He realized the house wasn't just shelter. It was something more, a witness, a survivor, like him. He placed his hand on the wall beside him. The wood was warm. "I'll take care of you," he murmured. The hum answered faint, but there, Nova stirred in the sleep, her paws twitching as if she were dreaming of running through the pines again. Elias smiled, for the first time in a long while. The loneliness didn't hurt. It just sat beside him, quiet, gentle, accepting. The nights passed, and each evening brought new whispers in the silence. Sometimes, the hum sounded like distant music. Other times, like the soft rhythm of a heart patient and eternal. He began to wonder, maybe all homes remember. Maybe the walls keep echoes of laughter and loss, the way trees keep the memory of every winter they've survived. And maybe, just maybe, some houses hum because they're still waiting for someone to listen. Elias was listening now. Outside, snow continued to fall, endless, white, and forgiving. Inside, the cabin glowed faintly, alive once more. A soldier and his dog sat by a fire, listening to the heartbeat of a house that refused to die. And in the still air between them, the faint words on the window appeared again, not written by fear, but by grace. "You are safe." Elias didn't wipe it away this time. He just whispered, "I know." The nights grew quieter. The wind softened. Even the hum beneath the cabin's floor seemed to settle, like the house itself was finally at peace. And for the first time in years, Elias began to sleep. Not the restless kind, the kind that jerks you awake with ghosts in your throat. This was different. It was deeper, still, like the earth had pulled him in and said, "Rest now." The first dream came gently. He was back on the battlefield, the one his mind never truly left. Gray skies, ash falling like snow. The smell of smoke and metal, that metallic taste of fear on the tongue. He remembered the screams, the ground trembling beneath his boots, the endless echo of gunfire, and then through the fog a shape moved. Nova, her fur gleamed even in the chaos, her eyes sharp and unshaken. She barked once, that low, commanding sound that used to mean "Follow me," and Elias did. He followed her through the smoke, through the sound of men shouting, through the heavy rain of dust and memory. Everywhere she went, the noise dimmed, the air cleared, until all that was left was the steady rhythm of her paws against the earth. And then a whisper, so soft he thought it came from inside him. "Stay here, rest." He turned, but there was no one there, only Nova, sitting beside a shallow stream, looking up at him with eyes that said everything words couldn't. Elias knelt beside her. He pressed his forehead to hers, something he hadn't done since the war ended. And for a moment, everything was still. Then the dream dissolved. When he woke, the fire had burned down to embers. The air was cold, but not lonely. Nova lay by his side, breathing slow, her tail flicking in her sleep. Elias stared into the dark for a long time. That whisper still echoed in his chest. "Stay here, rest." It wasn't just a dream. It felt like a message from something ancient, maybe even from the house itself, or maybe from the part of him that still remembered how to hope. He reached over and scratched behind Nova's ear. She shifted, her eyes fluttering open for a second, just long enough to look at him as if to say, "I told you so." In the days that followed, Elias began to walk again, not far, just down to the edge of the lake. Raven Lake was still as glass in the morning, but at night, it changed. When the moon rose high, the water glowed faintly, eerily, a soft, bluish shimmer that rippled like something alive beneath the surface. The first time he saw it, Elias thought it was a trick of the light. But then Nova saw it too, her head tilted, her reflection lined with flickering blue. The glow came from nowhere he could name. It moved like smoke underwater, curling and drifting, sometimes taking shapes that looked almost human, figures, faces, hands, brushing the surface before fading away. He didn't feel afraid. In fact, he felt peace. He sat by the water's edge, his breath clouding in the cold air, and whispered, "Maybe they're the ones who found peace here before me." Nova wagged her tail once, softly, as if she agreed. The lake seemed to shimmer brighter for a moment, a quiet acknowledgement, a nod from something unseen. That night, as he sat by the fire, Elias thought about all the souls who must have passed through this place. The hunters, the travelers, the lost ones, each leaving something behind. A footprint, a whisper, a memory, and maybe the lake had kept them all. Maybe that's why it glowed, not from magic or science, but from memory itself, from lives that had learned, finally, how to rest. He thought about how long it had been since he'd felt that kind of stillness, how long since sleep didn't mean surrender, how long since he'd stopped running from his own mind. Nova shifted beside him, her breathing steady, her warmth pressed against his leg. He smiled, tracing small circles in her fur. "Maybe that's what peace really is," he murmured. "Not the absence of pain, but learning to stay anyway." The hum under the floor returned, deep and gentle, almost like agreement. He leaned back, eyes half closed, and let himself listen. To the fire, to the house, to the faint, distant lapping of the lake outside, blowing like a heartbeat under the stars. As the nights went on, the dreams returned, but they changed. The battlefield was still there, but softer now, blurred at the edges. Each time, Nova led him through it. Each time, the voice whispered the same words, "Stay here, rest," until one night, he realized it wasn't a command, it was an invitation. Not just to rest his body, but to stop fighting the life he'd already survived. One morning, Elias woke before dawn. He stepped outside, the air sharp with frost. The lake was still glowing faintly, not blue this time, but pale gold, like morning light beneath the surface. He knelt down, his reflection rippling across the water. For a moment he saw two faces, his and another, the outline of a man in old clothes, standing beside a dog that wasn't Nova. He blinked, and the image was gone. But he didn't doubt what he saw. He just whispered to the empty air, "Maybe you found peace here first? Thank you for leaving a place for me." The water shimmered once, then stilled. Nova barked softly, once the sound echoing across the lake like a promise. When he went back inside, Elias felt the hum of the house rise again, gentle, like the rhythm of a slow heartbeat. He placed his hand on the wall, feeling the warmth travel through his fingers. "Stay here," he whispered to himself. "Rest." And for the first time since the war, he truly believed he could. By spring, the air around Raven Creek had changed, not suddenly but quietly, like something waking from a long, gentle sleep. The snow began to thin on the ridge, moss brightened along the stones. And when Elias opened the cabin door one morning, the smell of wet pine and soil rolled in alive. Breathing, Nova bounded out ahead of him, nose to the ground, tail swaying like a pendulum of joy. She barked toward the roof, sharp and excited. Elias looked up. On the old uneven eave, the one he'd patched just weeks before, a pair of robins were building a nest, bits of straw, feathers, and bark tucked into the cracks of the wood. He couldn't help but laugh. "Guess we're not the only ones fixing the place up," he said softly. Nova barked again, as if to agree. The days became a kind of rhythm: mend, build, rest, repeat. Elias fixed what he could: the loose shutters, the leaky gutter, the splintered porch steps that had long forgotten the weight of a man's boots. He oiled the hinges, replaced broken panes with old glass he found in the shed. Every nail driven in felt like a heartbeat returning. At night, he'd sit by the fire, writing in a weathered notebook he found tucked in one of the drawers. Not about the war, not anymore, but about this. About how the air smelled when it rained. About how Nova had learned to nap under the kitchen table, the one spot where sunlight lingered longest. About how the house itself seemed to hum with him, as though matching his pulse. He wasn't sure if that was real, but he didn't need it to be. The first time he noticed the warmth, it was subtle. He was sitting on the floor by the fireplace, tracing his finger along the cracks in the stone wall. The air outside was cold enough to bite, but the stones beneath his palm were warm faintly, like skin touched by sunlight. He leaned closer. The warmth deepened, spreading slowly through his fingertips, up his wrist. Nova lifted her head and sniffed the air, ears pricking. Then she relaxed again, resting her head on her paws with a low, contented sigh. Elias whispered, almost to himself, "You feel it too, don't you?" The hum under the floor answered, soft, rhythmic, not mechanical, not the wind, something alive. Over the next few weeks, the warmth grew. Every time Elias finished a repair, when he drove the last nail, or painted the last board, the light in the hearth would flare, a brief golden glow, brighter than fire should burn. The first few times he thought it was just a drake, but the pattern was too consistent. Every good thing he did for the house, every act of care, every small kindness brought that pulse of light. And every night after, when the fire dimmed to coals, he'd hear it again, the breathing, slow, even, like the cabin itself was exhaling, finally a peace. It wasn't frightening, if anything. It felt familiar, like he and the place shared the same lungs now. He would lie there, one hand resting on Nova's fur, the other on the rough floorboards, and as both heartbeats sensed hers, and the house as he drifted to sleep, feeling, for the first time and forever, connected. One afternoon, after mending the last of the window frames, Elias stepped back and looked around. The walls that had once leaned now stood straight. The roof no longer wept. Even the air inside felt lighter, carrying the smell of wood and smoke and something softer, like new beginnings. He ran his hand along the doorframe, the same one that had once been half rotted through. It was solid now, the grains smooth beneath his palm. "You're coming back to life, huh?" he murmured. From the yard, Nova barked twice short, happy bursts. Elias laughed. "Yeah, you too, girl." That night, the glow in the fireplace burned longer than usual. Not wild, not fierce, but steady, patient. It filled the cabin with a low, golden heartbeat. Elias sat by it, notebook open, pen hovering. For a moment, didn't know what to write, so he simply wrote the truth. This house needed someone, and I think I needed it too. The fire crackled. The hum beneath the floor deepened, almost like a sigh of relief. Later, as he sat in the quiet, Elias realized how strange it felt to belong again. For years, he'd lived like a man passing through, always halfway out the door, half-rooted in memories that didn't want to let go. But here, in this small cabin by the creek, the world had finally stopped demanding anything of him. No orders, no noise, just breath and time. He thought about the note he'd found, that single line left behind decades ago. "Be kind to this place, and it will be kind to you." He looked around. The walls glowed softly. Nova snored beside the fire, and the warmth beneath his feet pulsed in gentle rhythm, steady and sure. It wasn't just kindness that the place had returned, it was life. Outside, the robins had hatched. Their faint, fragile chirps filled the night, blending with the whisper of the trees and the distant murmur of the creek. Elias smiled as he listened. "Sounds like the house has company," he said. Nova's ears twitched, but she didn't stir. She was already dreaming. Elias leaned back in his chair, eyes closing. He let the hum carry him, the breath of the cabin wrapping around him like a slow lullaby. For a long moment, there was no difference between man, beast, and home, all three beating together in quiet harmony. And in that stillness, Elias understood something simple and sacred. Sometimes the soul doesn't just need a place to stay, it needs a place to heal. And as long as the cabin breathed, so would he. It came without warning, the kind of storm that doesn't creep, but descends by nightfall. The wind had already turned wild, rolling through the trees like a wounded animal. The forest around Raven Creek roared. Branches split. Rain hammered the windows in sheets. Elias stood by the door, one hand pressed against the old wood, feeling it tremble beneath the force of the wind. Nova paced beside him, restless, ears flat, tail low. "Easy, girl," he whispered. "We've seen worse than this." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure. The first crack of thunder hit like an explosion, sharp, close, immediate, the kind that shakes the air out of your chest. The lights from the hearth flickered, shadows lashing across the stone walls. Outside, a tree went down, the crunch echoing through the hollow. The ground itself seemed to shudder. Elias pulled Nova close and backed into the center of the room, away from the windows. She pressed a body against his leg, trembling, eyes wide but trusting. For a brief moment, Elias saw the desert again, dust storms sweeping over the outpost. The way the earth turned orange and alive and dangerous. He'd been through worse storms, or so he told himself. But this one was different. This one felt awake. The wind screamed through the chimney, and the cabin groaned under its weight. The roof creaked like a ship lost at sea. Elias could hear the wood strain, the nails whining in protest. He gritted his teeth, bracing for the sound of something giving way, a beam, a wall, anything. Instead, he heard something else. A low, steady hum. It started beneath his feet, faint at first, like the purr of distant machinery, but then it deepened, rolling through the floorboards, up the stone walls, into the air itself. Nova's ears perked. She stopped trembling, her head tilted, as though listening to something Elias couldn't quite hear. He crouched beside her, hand on the floor, and that's when he felt it, the warmth. It wasn't the fire, the flames had dimmed, but the stones were glowing, not orange, not red, but soft blue. Faint veins of light threaded through the mortar, weaving across the walls like arteries under skin. The entire cabin seemed to pulse, alive, vibrant, not resisting the storm, but meeting it. The hum grew louder, stronger in rhythm, in purpose. Boom, the thunder outside thrum, the pulse beneath the floor. The two sounds collided, then merged until Elias could no longer tell which came from the sky and which from the stone. He realized, with a strange calm, that the cabin wasn't just holding up against the storm, it was protecting them. Nova pressed closer, head resting on his knee. Her breathing slowed, syncing with the hum. Elias ran his hand along her back, and for the first time in years, he felt something other than fear in the middle of chaos. The air inside the cabin thickened with a quiet blue glow. The wind still screamed outside, trees still fell, lightning still shattered the sky, but here, inside these old stone walls, there was a heartbeat, a living, breathing rhythm. Elias looked up at the words carved faintly above the hearth letters he hadn't noticed before. Hidden beneath soot and dust, Haven Rest. The storm outside raged on, but within those walls, something older was at work. The hum beneath him steadied, wrapping around the cabin like invisible arms. Every strike of thunder met with an answering pulse from the foundation. Stronger, surer, a heartbeat that said, "Hold on." Elias closed his eyes, leaned back against the warm stone, and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't know if he was speaking to the cabin, the creek, or whatever lived between them, but the hum seemed to answer deeper, slower, like a quiet acknowledgement. Nova lifted her head and let out a single, low bark, not of warning, but recognition. Outside, the storm screamed into the night. Inside, the walls glowed softly, steady as breath. Haven Rest, the name finally made sense. It wasn't just a place, it was a promise. When Elias woke the next morning, the world outside was silent in that strange, holy way it gets after a storm. The air was heavy with the smell of wet pine and earth. Puddles mirrored a sky still bruised with clouds. Trees leaned, broken in half. The forest looked torn open, raw, but alive. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes. Nova was already awake, tail wagging, nose twitching at something near the fireplace. "Hey girl, what is it?" Elias murmured, his voice still hoarse. Nova nudged her snout toward the hearth, the same stone fireplace that had glowed like a living thing during the storm. Elias crouched down, brushing away bits of soot and ash, and there, in a thin crack between two stones, was something he didn't expect to see. A sprout. Small, fragile, but unmistakably alive. Its green was almost unreal bright, defiant against the gray stone. The kind of green you only see in spring, when the world decides it still believes in itself. Elias stared. For a long time he didn't move. He just looked at that tiny seedling as if it had spoken to him, as if it was trying to tell him something. Nova sat beside him, ears pricked, breathing softly. "How the hell?" Elias whispered. "There's no soil here, no sunlight, just stone." He pressed his palm against the floor. The rock was still faintly warm, pulsing with that same quiet energy he'd felt during the storm. That storm that had tried to break everything, and somehow, this had grown from it. He smiled, the first real smile in once. It wasn't a miracle in the grand sense of the word, but it was one in the small, personal sense, the kind of miracle you notice only when you've lost almost everything else. He went outside, gathered a few round pebbles from the path, and built a tiny circle around the sprout, a kind of fortress, or maybe a promise. When he was done, he sat back on his heels, wiping his hands on his jeans. "If you can grow here," he said softly, "then maybe I can start again too." Nova tilted her head, as if she understood. Elias chuckled under his breath. "Yeah, I know. Sounds stupid, huh?" He looked around the room. The walls were cracked. The roof still leaked. Half the shelves had fallen during the storm, but somehow, with that small green thing in the middle of the wreckage, it didn't feel broken anymore. It felt like a beginning. He went to the window. Outside, The forest shimmered, every leaf dripping in the sunlight that finally broke through. Steam rose from the wet earth, twisting like breath. The river below the hill had overflowed its banks, carrying branches, leaves, whole memories downstream. And yet here, in this ruined little cabin, something was growing, something that didn't ask permission. Elias sat by the fireplace for a while, just watching the tiny plant. He thought of Lydia, her laughter, her warmth, how she used to press her hands into the soil when she planted tomatoes behind their old house. She used to say, "Everything wants to live, Eli, even the things that look like they can't." He hadn't touched a garden since the day she died. Now, watching this fragile sprout reach for light that barely existed, he felt something shift inside him, something that had been frozen since that night. Maybe it wasn't hope, not yet, but it was close. He poured a bit of water from his flask onto the stone, careful not to drown the tiny roots. The droplets rolled down the cracks like tears. Nova rested her head on his knee, eyes half closed. Content. For the first time in a long while, Elias didn't feel the urge to leave. He didn't feel trapped by the house. He didn't feel haunted. He felt connected. As the light outside faded, he stayed by the hearth, the soft hum of the house filling the silence. The faint pulse beneath the floor sink with his heartbeat steady, gentle. "Alive," he whispered again, barely audible, as if speaking to the stone, to the sprout, to the memory of everyone he'd lost. "Yeah, maybe we both get another chance." And for that night, the small cabin on Raven Creek breathed quietly with him, one man, one dog, one fragile green sprout, and the first hint of life after the storm. When Elias woke the next morning, the world outside was silent in that strange, holy way it gets after a storm. The air was heavy with the smell of wet pine and earth. Puddles mirrored a sky still bruised with clouds. Trees leaned, broken in half. The forest looked torn open, raw, but alive. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes. Nova was already awake, tail wagging, nose twitching at something near the fireplace. "Hey girl, what is it?" Elias murmured, his voice still hoarse. Nova nudged her snout toward the hearth, the same stone fireplace that had glowed like a living thing during the storm. Elias crouched down, brushing away bits of soot and ash, and there, in a thin crack between two stones, was something he didn't expect to see. A sprout, small, fragile, but unmistakably alive. Its green was almost unreal bright, defiant against the gray stone, the kind of green you only see in spring, when the world decides it still believes in itself. Elias stared. For a long time, he didn't move. He just looked at that tiny seedling as if it had spoken to him, as if it was trying to tell him something. Nova sat beside him, ears pricked, breathing softly. "How the hell?" Elias whispered. "There's no soil here, no sunlight, just stone." He pressed his palm against the floor. The rock was still faintly warm, pulsing with that same quiet energy he'd felt during the storm. That storm that had tried to break everything, and somehow, this had grown from it. He smiled, the first real smile in months. It wasn't a miracle in the grand sense of the word, but it was one in the small, a personal sense, the kind of miracle you notice only when you've lost almost everything else. He went outside, gathered a few round pebbles from the path, and built a tiny circle around the sprout, a kind of fortress, or maybe a promise. When he was done, he sat back on his heels, wiping his hands on his jeans. "If you can grow here," he said softly, "then maybe I can start again too." Noah tilted her head, as if she understood. Elias chuckled under his breath. "Yeah, I know, sounds stupid." He looked around the room. The walls were cracked, the roof still leaked. Half the shelves had fallen during the storm, but somehow, with that small green thing in the middle of the wreckage, it didn't feel broken anymore. It felt like a beginning. He went to the window. Outside, the forest shimmered, every leaf dripping in the sunlight that finally broke through. Steam rose from the wet earth, twisting like breath. The river below the hill had overflowed its banks, carrying branches, leaves, whole memories downstream. And yet here, in this ruined little cabin, something was growing, something that didn't ask permission. Elias sat by the fireplace for a while, just watching the tiny plant. He thought of Lydia, her laughter, her warmth, how she used to press her hands into the soil when she planted tomatoes behind their old house. She used to say, "Everything wants to live, Eli, even the things that look like they can't." He hadn't touched a garden since the day she died. Now, watching this fragile sprout reach for light that barely existed, he felt something shift inside him, something that had been frozen since that night. Maybe it wasn't hope, not yet, but it was close. He poured a bit of water from his flask onto the stone, careful not to drown the tiny roots. The droplets rolled down the cracks like tears. Nova rested her head on his knee, eyes half closed. Content. For the first time in a long while, Elias didn't feel the urge to leave. He didn't feel trapped by the house. He didn't feel haunted. He felt connected. As the light outside faded, he stayed by the hearth, the soft hum of the house filling the silence. The faint pulse beneath the floor sank with his heartbeat steady, gentle, alive. He whispered again, barely audible, as if speaking to the stone, to the sprout, to the memory of everyone he'd lost. Yeah, maybe we both get another chance. And for that night, the small cabin on Raven Creek breathed quietly with him: one man, one dog, one fragile green sprout, and the first hint of life after the storm.